When an elderly woman named Margaret gets lost in a deadly winter storm, hope seems out of reach until Whiskers, a clever stray dog, steps in to lead her to safety at the cabin of Thomas, a reclusive widower with a past as cold as the snow outside. As the storm rages on, an unexpected rescue mission brings new life and second chances. But when they find a lost child on the brink of danger, can they pull together to save him? And will the storm outside break down the barriers inside their hearts? Watch to discover how loyalty, bravery, and connection can emerge from the harshest of nights. The air crackled with the biting chill of winter as the last strands of daylight melted into the icy blue of night. Margaret, an elderly woman whose hair, silver and wild as storm clouds, framed her wrinkled face, stood on the front steps of her modest home. She held a small bag of woolen scarves she'd knitted, fingers still marked by the years spent coaxing life out of thread and needle. Margaret had always prided herself on her independence, refusing help from the neighbors who had long offered to walk with her or run her errand. Tonight, a promise made to the church committee to deliver these scarves spurred her onward, even as a whispering wind nipped at her ankles. The streets were eerily quiet, buried under a quilt of fresh snow that muffled every sound. The light from the street lamps fell in pale patches, dimmed by the swirling flurries that thickened by the minute. With each step, Margaret's boots crunched and sank, each footprint quickly consumed by the wind's breath. "Just a few blocks," she whispered, a determined flicker in her voice, as the sky darkened faster than she had anticipated. In the deepening twilight, a pair of eyes, keen and golden, glimmered from the shadowed mouth of an alley. Whiskers, a stray dog with a mottled coat of brown and white, watched her intently. He was a familiar figure in the neighborhood, scrappy, clever, surviving off the kindness of strangers and the occasional scavenged meal. He sensed a shift in the air, not just the storm, but something else, a quiet urgency that tugged at his instincts. Margaret's progress slowed, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated too quickly. The snow, now relentless, stung her cheeks and stiffened her woolen mitten. With a slight tremor in her hands, she reached into her bag, as if the warmth of the scarves might somehow seep into her. That's when her foot slipped on an icy patch. She gasped, arms flailing as she tumbled sideways, the cold seizing her body like a vice. From his post, Whiskers barked sharply, the sound cutting through the silence like a warning bell. Margaret's eyes fluttered open, snowflakes sticking to her lashes as the world blurred around her. She tried to rise, her body unresponsive, weighed down by the cold. Fear coiled in her chest, a realization that she might not make it home. In a heartbeat, Whiskers dashed forward, his paws splattering the snow as he reached her side. He sniffed at her face and whimpered, nudging her with his wet nose, as if trying to tell her, "Get up, you're not alone." Margaret's lips curved faintly, a fleeting smile that acknowledged the small, shivering shadow standing vigil over her. A distant memory sparked, a dog, long gone, that once sat at her feet as she knitted. The warmth of that recollection urged a tear down her cheek, even as her body shivered uncontrollably. "Not now, not like this," she whispered, though her voice was a mere wisp lost in the wind. Whiskers barked again, this time louder, more insistent, and then something shifted in the deep of the night. A flicker of movement behind them, a cabin's light glowed dimly at the end of the street. It was Thomas's place, the old widower who kept to himself, whom Margaret hadn't spoken to in years. Whiskers bounded toward the light, stopping every few strides to look back at her, urging her with eyes that refused to give up. Margaret's trembling hands pushed against the snow as she summoned strength she hadn't felt in years. This time, she was determined not to surrender, not while there was still a chance. Margaret forced herself up, her bones creaking as if they, too, resisted the icy grip of the storm. Each breath she took was sharp, like needles pricking her lungs, but Whiskers' barks rang through the night, guiding her gaze. He stood a few yards ahead, paws stamping in the snow as if to say, "Hurry!" The memory of warmth, of home, urged her to move. She clutched her bag of scarves, now damp and heavy, as she took one uncertain step and then another, following the sound of Whisker's urgent calls. The dim light from Thomas's cabin seemed to pulse, a beacon in the void, promising safety if only she could reach it. The path was familiar, but transformed by the swirling snow. It reminded her of when she was a girl, trudging home through wintry woods after helping her mother gather firewood. Back then, there had been no fear, only the thrill of adventure and the trust that home waited at the end of the journey. But now, the cold pressed against her like an enemy. Whiskers darted back to her side, nudging her legs and circling impatiently. Margaret felt the whisper of defeat in her limbs, but she reached down to touch his fur, drawing from it the comfort of another heartbeat. The small dog's warmth spread through her glove like a plea to keep moving. "Just a bit further," she murmured, more to convince herself than him. Ahead, the old cabin loomed, its roof crowned with snow and smoke, trailing thinly from its stone chimney. Thomas's place was a relic, standing solitary and proud at the edge of the town, like its owner, weathered and resilient. Margaret's visits there had been sparse over the years. Thomas had withdrawn into himself after his wife's passing. A gulf of unspoken words and shared losses had distanced them, even though they once exchanged neighborly smiles. Whiskers barked once more, the sound sharper, as the cabin door creaked open to reveal Thomas himself. His tall frame was backlit by the flickering glow of the hearth, casting long, wavering shadows into the snow. He squinted into the storm, his eyes dark with surprise when he saw Margaret standing like a figure in a snow globe, shaking with cold and exhaustion. "Margaret!" His voice was rough, as though unused to conversation. He took a step forward, hesitated, then surged into motion, striding through the snow to reach her. The moment his hands gripped her shoulders, Margaret felt relief so profound that it nearly buckled her knees. Thomas guided her inside, a mixture of urgency and disbelief on his face. Whiskers followed, shaking snow from his fur as he crossed the threshold into warmth and light. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and the faint sweetness of old tobacco. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, flames dancing with a life Margaret hadn't felt in hours. Thomas helped her into an armchair near the fire and draped a thick blanket over her shivering frame. She closed her eyes for a moment, soaking in the heat that seeped through the layers of wool and snow-dampened clothes. "You could have died out there," Thomas muttered, his tone stern but eyes softening as he knelt beside her, rubbing warmth into her hand. His fingers, calloused from years of carving wood and tending a stubborn stove, moved gently. Margaret opened her eyes, finding his face lined with concern, the wear of solitude etched deep into his skin. "I didn't know where else to go," Margaret whispered, feeling the sting of pride swallowed by necessity. Her eyes drifted to Whiskers, now curled by the fire, watching them with those sharp, knowing eyes. "He brought me here." Thomas followed her gaze, a flicker of emotion crossing his face before it settled into an unreadable mask. "Clever dog," he said softly, almost as if speaking to himself. They sat in silence, the only sounds the snap of the fire and the faint howling of the storm that raged outside. The warmth spread through Margaret, and with it, the realization of what it had cost her to get here. Not just tonight, but in all the long years where words were left unsaid and doors were closed when they should have been opened. Thomas stood, pulling an old quilt off a nearby chair and tucking it around her legs. The familiarity of the gesture tugged at something deep in Margaret's chest, a memory she couldn't quite grasp. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of loneliness shift, replaced by the tentative touch of human connection. "Rest now," Thomas said, his voice softer. "The storm's not letting up anytime soon." Margaret nodded, eyes drifting shut as the fire's glow painted shadows on the walls. Whiskers' gentle breathing became the lullaby that pulled her under, safe for the first time in what felt like forever. Margaret awoke to the first light of dawn seeping through the frost-laced window panes. The storm had passed, leaving a crystalline stillness that filled the cabin with an almost sacred quiet. She shifted under the quilt, muscles aching from her ordeal, and her eyes found Whiskers, curled in a tight ball beside the hearth, chest rising and falling steadily. A pang of gratitude swept through her, sharper than the cold had been. "Morning!" Thomas's deep voice came from the corner of the room where he stood, a steaming mug in his hands. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the guarded distance between them wavered. He moved forward and handed her the cup, the heat seeping into her palms and bringing her comfort. Margaret took a sip, the warmth trailing down her throat and settling into her chest. She glanced up at him, noting the streaks of gray in his hair that hadn't been there the last time she'd seen him. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with unsaid things. "You really shouldn't have been out there," Thomas said, a mixture of chastisement and concern lingering in his words. His gaze shifted toward the dog, who stirred at the sound of his voice. Whisker's ears perked up, and he trotted over to Margaret, his tail wagging faintly. "I promised the church I'd deliver these," Margaret replied, lifting the damp bag of scarves with a rueful smile. "Old habits, you know." Thomas's eyes softened. "Some promises are worth more than pride," he said, the words sounding as though they carried a weight he hadn't meant to reveal. He reached out and patted Whisker's head, his hand pausing for a moment, lost in thought. "He's a smart one. We all knew he had more sense than any of us." Margaret laughed softly, the sound surprising her with how foreign it felt. It echoed warmly in the cabin, dissipating the shadows that clung to its corners. Whiskers seemed to take this as an invitation to leap up and place his front paws on her lap, nudging her hand insistently until she scratched behind his ears. "Looks like he's claimed you," Thomas said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. For a moment, Margaret felt a bond between them, formed not just by the night's events but by something older, rooted in shared memories of the town's festivals, whispered conversations on front porches, and the silent passing of time marked by seasons and losses. They were two survivors, each holding stories that weighed heavy, hidden behind their eyes. Thomas turned to stoke the fire, embers sparking with a hiss, and his silhouette cast long shadows across the room. "You remember when Millie used to bring her baking over?" he asked suddenly, the mention of his late wife filling the room with an invisible, tender ache. Margaret nodded, the corners of her mouth pulling up despite the pang in her chest. "She made the best apple turnovers. Always slipped an extra one into my hand when she thought no one was watching." He chuckled, the sound rumbling low. "She always knew what people needed even before they did. Kindness came to her naturally." Silence settled again, thicker now with the comfort of shared grief, not the isolation of it. Whiskers lay down at Margaret's feet, eyes drifting shut, content with his new position as the guardian of their fragile truce. The cabin, filled with the smell of cedar and the subtle warmth of nostalgia, seemed to breathe with them. For the first time in years, Thomas felt the heaviness in his chest ease, and Margaret sensed that she wasn't alone in her struggle against time's relentless march. "Thomas, why did you close yourself off?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she tensed, expecting him to shut down, to turn away as he had so many times before when anyone came too close. He stared into the flames, their flickering light reflecting in his eyes. "Because it felt easier than remembering," he said finally, voice low and raw. "Easier than living with the reminders of everything I couldn't change." Margaret reached out, her hand brushing his sleeve. The gesture was light, almost hesitant, but it spoke volumes. Whiskers opened one eye as if to witness this unspoken exchange, his tail giving a soft thump against the floor. "And yet, here we are," she said softly, "brought back to life by a little dog who won't let us forget." Thomas looked down at her hand, then at Whiskers, and finally back at Margaret. The lines on his face shifted, the stoicism giving way to something vulnerable, something that whispered of hope. "Here we are," he echoed, the words carrying a weight of acceptance, a promise that perhaps they weren't as alone as they had believed. The morning light poured in stronger now, casting a golden glow that washed over them like a blessing. Whiskers stretched out, content, as if his job was done for the moment. The outside world, cloaked in a fresh blanket of snow, seemed brighter, softened by the light. Inside, a spark of warmth grew, fragile but real, shared between two old friends and the clever dog that had drawn them together. The sun climbed higher, melting the frost on the window panes and casting playful beams across the room. Margaret felt the stiffness in her limbs ease under the combined warmth of the fire and the company. Thomas, leaning against the edge of the hearth, seemed lost in thought, fingers tapping absently against the stone mantel. Whiskers had resumed his role as sentry, eyes half open, ears twitching at every creak of the old cabin. "Do you remember the winter of '72? Margaret asked, a smile ghosting her lips. The memory of that time, buried under decades of life's noise, surfaced like a photograph suddenly found in an attic box. Thomas's eyebrows lifted in surprise, a flicker of recognition sparking in his gaze. "The one where the river froze solid and we all skated on it?" "Yes," Margaret said, the memory warming her voice. "And the old pine at the edge of the ice gave way, sending everyone scrambling." Thomas chuckled, the sound breaking through the melancholy that had settled around him like a shroud. "I remember you being the one who dared to skate closest to it, saying it wouldn't fall." "I was wrong," she laughed, the memory unfurling like a bloom between them. "But you pulled me back before I could test my luck." The moment hung between them, a shared piece of their past bridging the distance that had grown over the years. Whiskers, sensing the shift, lifted his head and looked between the two with curious eyes. The atmosphere in the cabin changed as a heavy knock at the door startled them. Thomas's body tensed, a reaction that spoke of years spent shielding himself from the world. Whiskers barked once, the sound sharp and protective. Margaret glanced at Thomas, noting the way his hand hovered near the latch, fingers curled in hesitation. "Who could it be?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. Thomas sighed, his shoulders sagging as he reached for the handle. The door creaked open, letting in a rush of frigid air and a figure bundled in a coat so thick that only dark eyes were visible. The stranger removed their scarf, revealing Elena, a young woman from the town's community center. "Elena," Thomas said, his voice tinged with surprise and relief. "I heard about the storm," Elena said, eyes darting between Thomas and Margaret. "People have been out searching for you, Mrs. Walters. When no one saw you come back home last night." Margaret's heart squeezed at the realization that others had worried for her, that the thread of her presence in the town still mattered. She nodded, her smile faltering as exhaustion seeped back into her bones. "It was Whiskers," Thomas said, gesturing to the dog. "He found her and led her here." Elena's gaze softened as she crouched and stroked the dog's head. "Clever boy," she said, her voice warm. "Everyone at the center talks about him, you know. He's become something of a legend." Whiskers wagged his tail, eyes glistening with the kind of affection only a stray-turned hero could hold. Margaret felt a swell of pride for the little creature who had defied the odds to save her. Thomas shifted, rubbing the back of his neck. "I should get her back to her home soon," he said, the practicality returning to his voice. But beneath it, Margaret could sense the reluctance, as if the hours spent together in this shared space had chipped away at the fortress he'd built. Elena straightened, folding her arms across her chest as if weighing her response. "Maybe she shouldn't be alone just yet," she suggested gently, glancing at Margaret. "Would you be okay staying here for a bit longer, Mrs. Walters?" Margaret's heart fluttered at the offer, at the subtle promise of more moments filled with conversation and laughter, of being needed and remembered. She looked at Thomas, whose expression was guarded, but his eyes spoke of the same hope and uncertainty she felt. "If it's not an inconvenience," Margaret said softly, the question more for Thomas than for Elena. Thomas nodded, the movement slow but sure. "Stay as long as you need," he said, his voice carrying a note that hinted at something deeper, a willingness to open the door to more than just one stormy night's shelter. Elena's eyes glistened with quiet approval. "I'll let the town know she's safe and warm. We'll send some supplies over." When she left, the room fell back into the quiet rhythm of crackling firewood and the soft breathing of Whiskers, who seemed to understand that his work was not quite finished. Margaret felt the room shift again, this time with the potential of a new beginning. The air between her and Thomas was heavy with what could be, a rekindling of connection long lost but never truly forgotten. Whiskers nuzzled against Margaret's leg, as if to say, "See, even in the coldest winter, warmth finds a way." Thomas poured 2 more cups of tea, his movements no longer stiff with solitude but careful, as if this moment were a fragile thing to be handled with care. He handed one to Margaret, and their fingers brushed, a fleeting touch that held the weight of all the conversations they had yet to have. They sat, facing the fire, whiskers curled up between them, as outside, the sun began to melt the last of the storm. Inside, the cabin held the echo of something being rebuilt, not just a shared past, but a shared hope. The days passed slowly, each one marked by whispered stories, shared over cups of tea, and the soft padding of Whisker's paws as he moved between them like a guardian of their fragile peace. Margaret felt warmth returning to her bones, not just from the fire, but from the threads of connection that wove between her and Thomas, drawing tighter with every shared laugh and memory. But on the 4th day, the sky turned a muted gray, and a biting wind swept through the trees outside, bringing with it an unsettling chill. Margaret shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She glanced at Thomas, who stood by the window, his expression shadowed as he watched the dark clouds gather. Whiskers, sensing the tension, sat upright, his ears perked and eyes darting between them. "Another storm?" she asked, her voice tinged with a worry she hadn't felt in days. Thomas nodded, the creases in his brow deepening. "Looks like it. Worse than the last, too." Margaret's heart thudded in her chest. Memories of her harrowing night, lost and vulnerable, crept back like tendrils of cold, wrapping around her resolve. Whiskers whined softly, his tail twitching nervously, as if the very air had begun to hum with the approaching storm. "We need to check on the others," Thomas said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Elena mentioned some of the older folks on the outskirts. If this storm is as bad as they say, they'll need help." Margaret's eyes widened, a mix of fear and determination flaring within them. "You can't go alone. Let me come with you." Thomas turned to her, his eyes searching hers for a long moment. "Margaret, it's dangerous. I survived once, didn't I?" Her voice was firmer now, carrying a resolve that surprised even her. "Besides, Whiskers will come, and he's proven himself more than capable." The dog barked, a sharp sound of agreement, and Thomas's lips curved into a reluctant smile. "All right," he said, his voice low, "but we move quickly. The storm won't wait for us." They bundled in layers, Margaret donning her thickest coat and scarf, and Thomas grabbing an old lantern and a bag with supplies. Whiskers bounded ahead as they stepped out into the cold, his breath puffing in small clouds as he led the way through snow that crunched beneath their boots. The first flakes of the storm drifted down, soft and innocent at first, until the wind picked up, sending them swirling into their faces like tiny, stinging needles. The world around them grew muted, as if the snow swallowed sound itself. Margaret's heart thudded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears as they pressed onward toward the edge of town. They arrived at the small wooden house of Mrs. Patel, a widow whose laughter had once been the loudest at the community center, but who had grown frail in recent months. Thomas knocked firmly, calling out, "Mrs. Patel, it's Thomas and Margaret. Are you all right?" There was a long pause, filled only by the howl of the wind, before a faint voice answered. Come in. It's too cold for guests outside." They pushed the door open, the rush of warmth inside enveloping them like a reprieve. Mrs. Patel sat by her old patchwork quilt, a shawl pulled tight over her thin frame. Her eyes lit up at the sight of familiar faces. "You brave souls, coming out in this weather," she said, her voice quivering but full of gratitude. "We couldn't leave you here alone," Margaret said, crossing the room to hold the older woman's hand. Whiskers leapt onto a nearby stool, sitting like a proud sentry, eyes alert. The wind roared outside, rattling the windows as the storm grew fiercer, and Thomas set about checking the wood supply and adding more to the fire. He moved with purpose, his every action driven by a need to protect those within these 4 walls. Margaret watched him, a swell of admiration filling her chest. This was the man she remembered, the one who had once been the heart of their small community, unyielding and kind. But the storm had other plans. A sudden, sharp crack echoed outside, followed by a shudder that ran through the floor. Margaret's eyes met Thomas's, wide and questioning. "The old pine," he muttered, voice tight with dread. He dropped the firewood and grabbed the lantern, rushing to the window. Outside, he could barely make out the shape of a massive tree, its branches clawing at the sky like gnarled fingers. It leaned precariously over the path that led back into town, splintering under the weight of the ice. "Thomas, it's going to fall," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling as she gripped Mrs. Patel's hand tighter. Before Thomas could respond, the tree gave way, collapsing with a thunderous roar that shook the house. Whiskers barked wildly, darting to the door, ears pinned back in alarm. The path back was blocked. Thomas's jaw clenched as he stared at the felled tree, a silent war waging behind his eyes. Margaret felt a rush of panic, the realization that they were trapped until the storm passed, that help would be unable to reach them. "Thomas," she said, stepping closer, "we'll manage. We have each other." His gaze softened as it met hers, and for a moment, the noise outside seemed to fade. In that instant, the fear was still there, but so was something stronger. Trust. "We will." He nodded, the words more a promise than an agreement. Whiskers settled beside Margaret, pressing against her leg as if to reassure her. They were caught in the storm once more, but this time, they weren't alone. The wind outside roared with a ferocity that made the cabin walls shudder, as if testing their resolve. Inside, the room was thick with an uneasy silence, broken only by the pop and crackle of the fire. Margaret sat beside Mrs. Patel, who clutched her hand with surprising strength for someone so frail. Thomas paced the small space, eyes darting from the blocked door to the window, the muscles in his jaw tight with tension. Whiskers, ever alert, shifted between pacing with Thomas and nudging Margaret's knee, his eyes wide with worry. Margaret took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. They were safe for now, she reminded herself, but the weight of the storm pressing down on them was palpable. "Thomas, sit down," she urged, her voice a soothing counterpoint to the chaos outside. He hesitated, glancing at her with eyes that spoke of 1,000 worries, before finally sinking into the chair beside her. The firelight carved deep shadows into his face, highlighting lines that spoke of sleepless nights and buried grief. "We're cut off," he said, the words hanging heavy between them. "If this storm lasts through the night, the cold will be brutal. We have enough wood for now, but we'll make do," Margaret interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Together we'll manage." Thomas's eyes met hers, and the corners of his mouth twitched, as if trying to form a smile. The shared determination in that gaze told her he was remembering, just as she was, the strength they once drew from one another in times of hardship. Mrs. Patel, sensing the tension and finding her own bravery, patted Margaret's hand. "I used to tell my children that even the fiercest storms don't last forever," she said, her voice thin but steady. "And here we are, still standing." A faint smile touched Margaret's lips. "Wise words, Mrs. Patel." Suddenly, a sharp howl from outside pierced the room. Whiskers' ears shot up and he barked at the door, the fur along his spine bristling. Thomas stood abruptly, listening intently as the sound came again, this time clearer. It wasn't just the wind, it was a cry, distant but unmistakable. "Someone's out there," Thomas said, grabbing the lantern and moving to the window. He strained to see through the swirling snow, but could make out only shifting shadows. Margaret's pulse quickened. "Who would be out in this storm?" Whiskers barked again, a frantic, pleading sound. Without another word, Thomas turned and reached for his coat. "I have to see," he said, and the finality in his tone left no room for argument. "Wait, Thomas," Margaret said, standing. Fear coursed through her veins, not just for the storm outside, but for him, for the risk he was about to take. He looked at her, and in that moment she saw the man he used to be, the protector, the one who wouldn't turn his back on someone in need, no matter the danger. "I won't be long," he promised. Whiskers was already at the door, pawing at it, his loyalty bound to Thomas like a shadow. Margaret clenched her hands into fists, the urge to stop him warring with the knowledge that she couldn't. "Be careful," she whispered. With a nod, Thomas opened the door, and a rush of icy wind swept through the room, biting at their faces and stealing their breath. He stepped out into the storm, the lantern casting a weak, trembling light as the darkness swallowed him and Whiskers whole. Margaret sat back down, the warmth of the fire unable to chase away the chill that settled deep in her bones. Minutes stretched into an eternity, punctuated only by the pounding of her heart and Mrs. Patel's quiet prayers. Suddenly, another sound joined the wind, a bark, followed by the faint murmur of voices. Margaret shot to her feet, hope flaring in her chest. The door burst open and Thomas stumbled inside, snow clinging to his coat and hair. In his arms, he carried a small, shivering bundle, a child no older than 6, eyes wide with fear and cheeks flushed red from the cold. Whiskers trotted in behind him, shaking off snow and barking triumphantly. The room erupted into motion. Margaret rushed to help, wrapping the child in a blanket and guiding them closer to the fire. The child's eyes met hers, filled with both fear and relief, and Margaret's heart clenched as she saw a reflection of her younger self. Small, scared, but fighting to hold on. "Where did you find him?" Margaret asked, glancing at Thomas, who was catching his breath. "Out by the old church," he said, running a hand through his snow-dampened hair. His eyes found hers, gratitude and exhaustion mingling in their depths. He must have gotten separated from his family. Margaret turned back to the child, smoothing a hand over their hair. "You're safe now," she whispered. The child nodded, their small hands clutching the blanket with a fierce, silent determination. Mrs. Patel moved closer, eyes brimming with unshed tears. "A miracle! In the middle of all this!" Whiskers barked once more, as if to say, "Yes, and don't forget who found it." The cabin felt different now, fuller, infused with life that defied the storm raging outside. Thomas sank into a chair, pulling off his soaked gloves and looking at Margaret with a mixture of weariness and quiet triumph. "We're not alone," he said, and for the first time in years the words felt true. Margaret's eyes softened as she looked around the room. The old friends, the little stranger who had found safety in their midst, and the dog who had brought them all together. Despite the wind howling at the windows and the storm that continued to rage, there was warmth here that no winter could touch. The storm roared on through the night, but inside the cabin, the fire glowed fiercely, its warmth wrapping around the small group huddled together like a guardian's embrace. Margaret watched as the young boy, now settled between her and Mrs. Patel, fell into an exhausted sleep. His small chest rose and fell steadily, the fierce flush in his cheeks giving way to a gentler hue as the warmth seeped into his cold-touched skin. Whiskers lay curled up at his feet, his vigilant eyes finally closing as he, too, succumbed to the room's calm. Thomas sat across from them, hands clasped, staring into the flames. The sharp lines of worry that had carved his face now softened under the golden light. Margaret glanced at him, a quiet understanding passing between them. The ordeal of the night had chipped away at the walls that time and grief had built between them, and now only the fragile beginnings of something hopeful remained. "Who is he?" Mrs. Patel whispered, breaking the silence. Her eyes, though weary, sparkled with maternal concern as she looked at the child. Thomas shook his head. "I don't know. Found him stumbling near the church, calling out for someone." His voice was rough, but a touch of emotion lingered in it. "He was nearly lost in the drifts." Margaret's gaze fell on the boy's hand, still clutching the blanket as if it were a lifeline. "We'll have to find his family as soon as the storm passes," she said, her voice steady with resolve. She glanced at Whiskers, who twitched his ears as if agreeing in his sleep. "Thanks to him, we've all been saved more than once tonight." Thomas's lips twitched into the faintest smile. "Yes, thanks to him," he echoed, his eyes softening as they lingered on the dog. He reached over, scratching behind Whiskers' ears, causing the dog's tail to thump lazily against the floor. The wind outside began to shift, its howling replaced by a softer whistle as the storm's rage waned. Margaret felt the tension in her chest ease, replaced by a deep, bone-deep exhaustion that she knew would bring sleep as soon as her eyes closed. But she stayed awake a moment longer, listening to the quiet breathing around her, holding on to the stillness like a fragile gift. As dawn broke and a soft, pale light seeped through the frosted windows, Margaret stirred. The boy blinked awake, confusion and then recognition sparking in his eyes as he took in his surroundings. He looked at Margaret, and for a moment panic flickered across his small face. "It's okay," she said, reaching out to brush his matted hair away from his forehead. "You're safe now." The boy's eyes filled with tears that he quickly brushed away with the back of his hand. "I got lost," he whispered, voice cracking with the remnants of fear. "I couldn't find my way home." "We'll find your family," Thomas said, his voice a rumble that was surprisingly gentle. He glanced outside, noting the snow now resting quietly, no longer whipped into frenzied drift. "As soon as it's safe, we'll go back into town." Mrs. Patel, who had dozed off beside them, stirred and blinked awake. "You're brave, child," she said, her voice full of admiration. "It takes courage to fight against the cold and find your way to safety." The boy nodded slowly, a small, grateful smile breaking through his solemn expression. He looked at Whiskers, who sat up and yawned, as if just now remembering his duties. "He helped me," the boy said, pointing at the dog. "He found me and barked until someone came." Margaret's eyes glistened as she met Thomas's gaze. The events of the past day, the storm, and the boy's rescue felt almost like pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle finally clicking into place. They were here, in this small cabin, brought together by the unlikely heroism of a stray dog and the shared resilience they had almost forgotten they possessed. By midday, the storm had passed entirely, leaving a brilliant, dazzling silence in its wake. Snow sparkled like diamonds under the sun's rays, a breathtaking sight that almost made one forget the fear it had brought just hours before. Thomas and Margaret bundled the boy in warm clothes as they prepared to return to town. Whiskers trotted alongside, tail wagging, his eyes ever watchful. The path was slow, each step a reminder of the storm's power, but they pressed on, their breath coming in puffs that hung briefly in the still air. As they reached the edge of town, familiar voices called out, relief and joy mingling in their shouts as neighbors gathered around. "Samuel!" a woman cried, her voice breaking as she pushed through the crowd. She fell to her knees, gathering the boy in her arms, tears streaming down her face. "Mama," Samuel whispered, burying his face into her coat, clinging tightly. Margaret felt a lump form in her throat as she watched the reunion. She glanced at Thomas, who was looking at the scene with a mixture of joy and quiet understanding. Whiskers circled them, barking happily, his job as a guardian not forgotten even in this moment of triumph. The woman looked up at Margaret and Thomas, gratitude etching deep lines into her expression. "Thank you," she choked out. "Thank you for bringing him home." Margaret smiled, her eyes damp but bright. "It wasn't just us," she said, looking down at Whiskers, who wagged his tail, seemingly proud of himself. The crowd's laughter and voices filled the crisp air, warmth and relief spreading through the small town like a healing balm. Thomas glanced at Margaret, a question in his eyes that she answered with a nod. "Come by for tea," she said softly, her smile widening as he nodded back. As the townsfolk dispersed, taking Samuel and his grateful mother home, Thomas and Margaret turned toward their own houses. Whiskers trotted between them, his tail held high, a small hero in the quiet aftermath of the storm. And in that shared moment, as they walked side by side, the weight of loneliness and loss seemed to lift, replaced by something new, something that whispered of beginnings and hope that could withstand even the fiercest of storms. The town settled into a quiet peace in the days following the storm. The snow, once an unrelenting force, had become a pristine, glittering blanket that softened the edges of rooftops and muffled the sound of footsteps. Children played in the streets, their laughter echoing as they built snowmen and carved angels into the white, and shopkeepers swept their porches, exchanging greetings and sharing news of the miraculous events that had unfolded. Margaret watched from her window as Whiskers, now a celebrated hero in the town, pranced through the snow with Samuel and a gaggle of children trailing behind him. The boy, once so frightened, had found new strength in the tale of his rescue, regaling anyone who would listen with the story of the brave dog and the strangers who'd sheltered him in the storm. There was a knock at her door, sharp, and familiar. She opened it to find Thomas standing there, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, eyes crinkled with a warmth she hadn't seen in years. He held a small box wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine. "Thought I'd stop by with something for tea," he said, lifting the packet. Margaret's heart fluttered, an echo of the old, comfortable feeling she'd forgotten she could have. "Come in," she said, stepping aside and ushering him into the warmth. The scent of cinnamon and cloves filled the room, mingling with the fresh-baked bread that sat cooling on the counter. Whiskers trotted inside moments later, his coat dusted with snow and his tail wagging, as if declaring that he too deserved a place by the fire. Margaret poured tea, hands steady, heart full, and sat across from Thomas at the small wooden table. The flames in the hearth flickered, casting shadows that danced across their faces. They sipped in silence for a moment, each lost in thought, until Thomas set down his cup and cleared his throat. "You know, I'd forgotten what it was like," he said, eyes on the steam rising from his tea. "What's that?" Margaret asked softly, though she already sensed the answer. "To be needed, to feel like a part of something bigger than myself." He looked at her, eyes earnest, the guarded man she'd known fading into someone new, someone familiar and open. "This past week, the storm, you, and Whiskers," he gestured at the dog who lay curled by the fire, watching them with wise eyes. "It reminded me of what I used to be, before everything." Margaret's eyes glistened, her own heart resonating with the words. She reached across the table, their fingers brushing and then settling into a comfortable hold, like two halves finding their place. "We all lose parts of ourselves, Thomas," she said, a small smile breaking through. "But sometimes we find them again in the most unexpected places." Whiskers stirred, his ears twitching as if he understood that his work here was almost complete. The warmth of the fire and the shared comfort of silence filled the room, punctuated only by the soft creak of the logs settling and the distant shouts of children playing in the snow. Outside, the sun cast long golden beams over the town, illuminating the path where Samuel and his mother walked, their footprints crisscrossing with others as neighbors came out to greet them. The world seemed brighter, not just from the reflection of light on the snow, but from the collective warmth of people who had found connection and courage amid the cold. Thomas raised his cup, eyes meeting Margaret's with a light that spoke of old promises and new beginning. "To Whiskers," he said, his voice deep and sincere. The dog raised his head, tail thumping lazily as if accepting the toast. Margaret laughed, a sound that carried the weight of all that had been lost and found again. "To Whiskers," she echoed, lifting her cup. And in that shared moment, surrounded by the warmth of friendship and the steady crackle of the fire, they knew they had weathered more than a storm. They had rediscovered the ties that bound them, threads of love, loss, and hope, woven together into something unbreakable. Outside, the town sparkled under the winter sun, but inside, in the small house with a brave dog and two souls, brought back to life by adversity and kindness, it was the quiet glow of contentment that truly shone. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to HeroKind Stories for more tales of resilience, love, and the unbreakable bonds that unite us. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below and share this story with someone who could use a little warmth and inspiration today.